Hi, here I am inside of the standalone Reactor 5, and I wanted to give a quick introduction before I get to the instruments comparing Reactor 5 Player to the full version of Reactor 5, because I actually own the full version of Reactor 5. Now, there are two really major differences that you need to account for, one of which far more major than the other. I mean, there are lots of differences between the full version of Reactor 5 from the player, but there's two that are really going to matter, and one that really, really matters, so I'm going to get to that biggest one right now. Basically, it's that you cannot save presets for your instruments directly. Now I'm going to open a different one. Yeah, basically, you cannot save your presets directly inside of the Reactor 5 player. So let's say that I make like a really cool sound. I mean, I don't have my keyboard properly set up to the standalone version right now, so I can't play this, but let's just say that I worked 30 minutes to make a cool sound. Well, in the standalone, you can't save that. There's nothing you can do to save that in the standalone version of the player. In the full version, you click on this thing. I think there's actually a few ways of going about it, but in the player version, you cannot do that. The only way to save presets in the player version that you get with Komplete Elements is to do it inside of your DAW, to do it inside of your recording software. In which case, that's very possible, under the one caution that it can be unstable. I have had it happen before I had the full version of Reactor 5, where it would crash my software when I tried to open a particularly complicated preset. I don't really know why, but it has crashed a few times, meaning I would not rely on this version of Reactor 5 for live use. For recording time, as long as you're not professional and every minute is a large amount of money to you, like if you're a hobbyist, I would say it's not terribly big of an issue, so what if it crashes a few times? However, if you're going to perform, well, that might just be the end of your professional career. So I would not use Reactor 5 Player live ever. Unless you're just going to use the built-in presets, then it's fine. Do not build presets inside the standalone Reactor 5 player. If you're going to make your own sounds, you must do it inside of your DAW, and then save the sound with your DAW. You must, okay? Now, the other major thing, and this is something you might not really miss, but this is one thing I've noticed to be useful, is this thing right here gives lots and lots of different options, and you're not going to see this inside of the player. Namely, you can change the amount of voices. The default amount of voices for this instrument appears to be 4. So which means that 4 notes can be pressed down at the same time. If I tried to press 5 notes down at the same time, it would cancel one of them out. In the player, there's nothing you can do about that. In the full version of Reactor 5, you just change it. Let's say I want it to be 12, then boom, now it's 12. Now I can make really large chords. However, in the player, again, you're stuck with these 4, there's nothing you can do about it. And you get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other things you can do with the full version of Reactor. Another major difference is you can go into the view to see how things were made. Here's one of the inside views of how Oki Computer 2 was made. And each one of these things you double-click to find more stuff, more stuff. This appears to be one of the base levels. As you can see, these instruments are incredibly complicated, and you can go in and change every last single tiny detail of them in the full version of Reactor. It's really quite amazing. In fact, it actually allows you to combine instruments and effects. So let's say that I have Oki Computer here, and I would like to combine, let's see, this effect here inside of Oki Computer. I am more than capable of doing that. I'm not going to show you how. And maybe I want to add this and this and this all in here. The full version of Reactor 5 would allow for me to integrate every single one of these things into one thing. And I could basically make almost anything I could think of that way. I could make stuff that I never would have thought of. I can do things that no other instrument in the universe could ever do. And for this reason alone, I consider Reactor 5 to be one of the best synthesizers ever. However, the player can do none of that. With the player, you get the instruments you get and that's that, which is fine. But you get such an infinite amount more creativity once you have the full version of Reactor. So for that reason, if Reactor 5 interests you at all, if you have any interest in the kind of crazy things that Reactor 5 can do, I would highly recommend buying the full version of Reactor 5. Which, the cheapest way to do that normally is to buy the Complete package, currently Complete 9, and you'll get Reactor 5 in there with all the rest of the stuff. However, Reactor 5 has gone on sale for $100 once. That's when I bought it. I got this for $100, which is amazing. And they might do that again. So I would just keep watch for a sale if you plan to get Reactor 5 just itself, or you go and buy Complete 9 and get that in that. I mean, if you're into synthesis and combining and making and building your own sound and being original, Reactor 5 is the best workstation in the world for that. I firmly believe there's nothing better, at least when it comes to synthesis. And as you'll see throughout the rest of this lengthy video, the synthesizers inside of Reactor 5, even what they give you with Komplete Elements, is really something to behold. I mean, these are not cheap synthesizers. These sound amazing, every single one of them. And they all sound different. And if you had the full version of Reactor, you'd have infinitely more creativity with what you could do with them. But in the player version of Reactor 5 that you get with Komplete Elements, you can basically just play the instruments and that's that, which is fine, and it's more than you could possibly ask for $50. So with that in mind, now you have a bit of a background of what Reactor 5 is and what the limitations of the Reactor 5 player are. Now it's time to get to business. I'm going to be starting with the synthesizer Photon. So here I am inside of Reaper again, and I have Photon opened. I added a sidechain to this to make it bouncy, if need be, as I show how to do in Reaper in this video right here. So, with that said, I'm just going to get right into this. And by the way, when I'm going like this, that is me editing the sound with my mod wheel. Well, sort of mod wheel. I use the Roland A800 Pro keyboard, which does not have a formal mod and pitch wheel. It sort of has a stick thing. Look up an image of that on Google Images to see what I'm talking about. But for all intents and purposes, this is me moving my mod wheel up and down. So every time that I make the sound majorly change in some way in one of these presets, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, this sounds that good. I'm gonna try this with some side chaining now. So yeah, that's just one of the presets. I mean, whoever said that presets couldn't be amazing? Yeah, another amazing one. Now for a nice pad. Alright, let's move on now. Now for a sound that would be great for something really chill, maybe a really chill house song, I don't know. I'm not terribly great with electronic genres, even though I make that kind of music. Okay. Ah, this one. Many of you may recognize that as the Metroid theme. Metroid is one of my favorite games ever, especially Metroid Prime, and for some reason that sound makes me want to play the Metroid theme song. At least that part of it. So yes, a really nice deep sound. Let's move on again. Ah. It's called saw bass, and while it is a good bass, I actually particularly like the high end on this. This would be, again, a really good sound to layer. Layering is key. Now let's test this sound out in the bass region of sound where it was intended. Also quite nice. I really like it when I find a sound that's versatile along a large range of tone sound. It can go really high and really low, and everywhere in between and still sound good. That's what I like to see. Alright, let's move on to, here's another really hardcore one. That would be really good for some really dark dubstep, for when you want those really growling sounds. And there's actually a part 2 to this, another preset that's very similar that this guy made. And on that note, let's move on to our next sound. Our last sound, actually. Keep in mind how hardcore that was while you listen to this, okay? Same synthesizer. The same synthesizer that was making all of those growling sounds is doing this. So yeah, that is an example of how good the synthesizers are in Reactor 5. And if you were to buy the full version of Reactor 5, you would find a lot of synthesizers like that. And as I showed earlier, there is an absolutely absurd amount of creativity you could have with editing this thing, changing it if you happen to know what you're doing. It is a whole world of sound that, to my knowledge, not terribly many producers are taking advantage of. It seems like lots and lots of producers use Massive and Sylenth and stuff like that, which is fine, but you just don't have the same amount of creativity in those, the same amount of spectrum of what you could make as you would if you use Reaktor 5. Reaktor 5 is a sound designer's dream. It is one of the best pieces of software ever made as far as I am concerned. And while the Reaktor 5 player you get in Komplete Elements isn't as impressive, not nearly, it gives you a good idea of what Reaktor 5 can do. Because all of these synthesizers were made with Reaktor 5, with very small components that you add up, and you build an instrument. It's almost like an object-oriented programming language. I mean, it's really that deep. Meaning, if you're really going to get into Reaktor 5, you could build synthesizers, just like this one. Or you could modify synthesizers like this by making your own little things or additions, or you could even just flat out copy and paste different sections of Reaktor 5 synthesizers together. I mean, it's just amazing what you can do. So again, if this interests you at all, if any of these synthesizers jump out at you, I would recommend buying the full version of Reaktor 5 when you can. And on that note, let's move on to our next instrument. I want to talk about Steam Pipe 2 next. So here I am inside of Steam Pipe 2, one of the included synthesizers, and it's really interesting, as you could probably tell. It makes sounds of wind instruments and organs, and some interesting percussion-y instruments as well. That would be good for something eerie, maybe a horror movie. So I'm probably not going to spend any longer on Steam Pipe 2. I think you get the idea of what it does in general. I mean, it doesn't do a lot, but what it does do is very interesting and original. And in my opinion, beautiful. I love that instrument. Steam Pipe 2 is one of my favorite synthesizers, mostly because I know that there's not a lot else that can do what it does. And that's the beauty of Reaktor. It's experimental. It does stuff that other synthesizers don't do. On that note, let's head to Metaphysical Function next. That one is interesting. Alright, here I am inside of Metaphysical Function right now. And Metaphysical Function is a sound generator that manipulates a sample that is here. And you don't play Metaphysical Function, it makes sound all by itself, as you can see. And you use all of these controls to control the sound, to try to tame it a little bit. Of course, though, you can't tame it. Not really. And therein lies the beauty. Metaphysical Function will come up with sounds that you never would have thought of before. You just never would have come up with most of this stuff. And while it isn't good for musical things, if you like coming up with sound effects, then this is definitely something to look into. For more information on how it works, look up the YouTube user Brent Kelmer. He makes excellent tutorials on all things Reaktor, and he has a very helpful video on Metaphysical Function. You can click the link right here to watch his video on this. And also, in a previous video that I made, I explain how to hook this up to record in Reaper. This doesn't straight out of the box record. You have to do a couple of things. Click this link to watch my video on how to record it in Reaper. Maybe it'll be enough information to record it in whatever DAW you use if you don't use Reaper. Or maybe it won't. But if you use Reaper, that video should help you a lot. With all of that said, let's get right into this. Oops, I forgot to arm the track for recording. That would have been a wasted long amount of time. Good, now let us jump in.
This is not immediate transformed. This grasshopper is a victim. On the cloud hollows, flowing legends and everywhere in the world. This grasshopper
Alright, so I'm sure that you get the idea by now. This is some serious business, this instrument. The way that I would practically use this in my music is that after recording all of the sound, I would go back through it and see what kind of things sound interesting. You see, like, I bet that could be used for something. And of course, don't be afraid to modify the sound with external plugins after you record it. That's half the fun. But this is pretty much as experimental as you can get. I mean, an instrument that basically makes sound by itself, completely chaotic sound, and your job is to tame it, even though that is quite impossible. But if you try to tame it, you're going to get some really interesting sounds out of it that I do not believe most people would ever come up with on their own. And if you're the kind of person that likes to add interesting sound effects into their music, or just plain out wants to make some interesting sound effects, this is a good instrument to use for that. So, with Metaphysical Function out of the way, next we should check out Aerobic, which is a very interesting drum machine. It sounds really good. Alright, so here I am in Aerobic, which is a drum sequencer machine. It's very interesting. It has 6 units. Each unit plays a different sound. Like Unit 1, for an example, is your bass drum. And you can do some interesting stuff. It's a 16-step sequencer for each sound that you get to control. And the higher you have it is the louder the sound, and the lower you have it is the quieter the sound. And also for the 16-step sequencer, it doesn't need to go through all 16 steps for all of them. For individual units, you can make it go through any amount of steps you want, like these 6 here. So Unit 1 will only repeat these 6 steps, while all the others will still go through their 16. That can allow you to make some very interesting beats. And also below here you may notice the ×2, ×6, and ×7 roll settings. That allows sound to be repeated very, very, very quickly for an interesting sound effect. And up here there's all sorts of controls. And down here you have a couple of more controls regarding all of these things. Yeah, so I'm not really going to be covering this too deep, as I have covered this instrument in good detail before, in the previous set of videos that I made regarding Komplete Elements. Here is a link to the last time that I covered this particular instrument, and I did it in pretty good detail. There's also a good video on YouTube by the YouTube user Greg B. So with that said, I'm going to move on to Oki Computer 2. Hey, here I am inside of Oki Computer 2 right now. So I was initially just going to share some presets again, because I never actually took the time to learn how this worked. But then I decided, hey, why not just learn how this works? I've had this for long enough, I might as well learn how it works. So I looked online to learn how it works. Want to guess what I found? My old video on Oki Computer 2 and nothing else. I looked through all of the documentation, I looked on Google, I looked on YouTube. The only thing that comes up is the video that I made a few years ago demonstrating some presets from Oki Computer 2. You know, my Komplete Elements videos that I made some time ago. That's all that there is on this synthesizer pretty much anywhere on the internet. And that gives me the impression that I might not be the only person who's never taken the time to learn this one. So I began fiddling around, just kind of testing with things, and I came up with an interesting little sound, and I want to explain how I made that sound. And afterwards, I'm going to go through some presets, and then I'm going to call that a day, because I'm still kind of learning this synth. But I have the basics down by now, and I think it's worth sharing here. So take a listen to what I just came up with. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here in this one. This is a small synthesizer that is jam-packed with stuff, and it's really interesting, actually. So first, I'm going to tell you what things you need to pay attention to the most. You have your oscillator thing with a bunch of waveforms. You have your step sequencer, and then there's the modulation matrix. And then, of course, you have your ADSR, and you have your chorus. I'm sure if you've ever used a synthesizer before, you know what those are, so I'm not going to spend time on what those do. However, the oscillator, the waveforms, the step sequencer table, and the modulation matrix, this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing are what you need to know. So let's start with the waveforms, because that's the most fundamental thing here. Each of these squares, how it goes a green square, then a gray square, then a green square, then a gray square. Each of these squares contain a waveform, and as you would transfer through them, it would kind of phase from one to another. Actually, I'm just gonna go to the default sound so I can just demonstrate this. So here in the second square, I'm gonna add this kind of crazy wave. After I make my sound sustain longer. And you see how it's kind of fading out of one and fading into the other. And now I do that with this. Let's add one here. Add one here. I'm just gonna add like all random ones all the way through. And now we can phase all the way through it. Alright, so now that we have that set up, what can we do with that? Well, that's where the step sequencer and the modulation matrix come in. The modulation matrix kind of automates things. I think that would have been a better name for it, because it better explains what it does. It automates things, which is going, like here I'm going to make use of the step sequencer table by setting this top one to table. So I'm going to set the table to affect the wave. And also these buttons over here, these small buttons, engage all of them, and things should work fine. And then after you set up basically what's going to affect what, so A affects B, then here's a bar to affect which direction. And you see it was moving all by itself across those waveforms I defined earlier. So let's edit the controls to, for one, add a lot more of these steps. And you can already kind of see where it's going. Depending on how high or low I have these, depends on how far through the waveform spectrum it goes. And that can basically allow you to make some very interesting morphing sounds. I mean, this is actually kind of really cool. Alright, so that should give you a fairly basic idea of how this thing works. So now you can actually use it. Since I have not gotten terribly great at making sounds in this synthesizer, let's spend the rest of the time on the presets. First, let's just talk about what I think of this synthesizer. It's good for, well, it would be excellent for, like old video game sounds, like 8-bit video games. This would be a very, very good synthesizer if you like that kind of stuff. I could also see this doing really interesting sharp sounds, like for dubstep maybe, and then really good bass sounds. It is not the most versatile synth in the world, at least from the presets, but you can do some really nice stuff with it. If I have one major complaint about this synthesizer, and this is not something you'd be able to easily tell in the player, but since I have the full version of Reactor, I can tell. There's only 4 voices. That means you can only have 4 notes pressed down at the same time. I can change that for myself, because the full version of Reactor can edit literally anything about these things. So I can just change this to 12, and I can play large chords now. You cannot do that if you have the player, or in other words, if you got this with Komplete Elements. Oops, sorry. I don't want to go too deep into Reactor 5, that's not what I'm demoing here. So you're going to be stuck to playing 4 notes at the same time here, which is limiting. I would argue that synthesizers today should not have less than 8. I think any less than 8 for something you're expected to play with 2 hands is just way too limiting. But that's just me. Either way, it still sounds really good, and I guess I can show you a few presets now before we move on again. Ah yes, if you watched my previous videos on this, or basically if you've ever Googled a video on Oki Computer 2 ever in the history of ever, that means you likely came across the video I made on Komplete Elements demoing this before, and you've heard this preset before. It really demonstrates how cool the morphing can be between the waveforms. And here's an example of how interesting of a bass you can make. I think this is pretty cool. And I guess it can do pretty mellow kind of things too. So it isn't not a versatile synth, it's just not on the level of, like, Photon. I think it's still a pretty good instrument. I did not used to like this instrument, mostly because I didn't really know what I'm doing. But now that I actually kind of understand this thing, I like it. I think it makes a good sound, and I'm going to try to experiment more with this in the future. So, on that note, let's move on to our final instrument for our Reactor 5 selection, Reactor Spark. Hey, so here we are last but not least in Reactor Spark, which is a very good synthesizer, but it's a little bit weird that it's in here, because as far as I can tell, it is the same Reactor Spark that is sold as its own product for the same amount of money that Komplete Elements costs. Here I have the product page for Reactor Spark opened. It costs $50, just the same as Komplete Elements. And as far as I can tell, it's the same thing. I mean, at least from this image, it sure looks the same. I sure can't tell the difference. But anyway, it's a really good synthesizer made by Steven Schmidt himself, if that's how you pronounce that. He is the guy that made Native Instruments, and he designed this. So clearly it is really good, and it is a synth I have liked for a long time. The interesting thing about 46 over there is I was not actually doing anything. Apparently Spark can do sound generation. It sounds like something to do with feedback. The most control I had over that was moving my mod wheel, which, as you may have been able to tell, moves MC3. I'm pretty sure he does not use Reactor Spark, but that does sound, or at least remind me, a little bit of the bell sound that the artist AU5 uses, which I've been a fan of for a long time. I like that sound. And I find this sound to be of the same vibe. At least in the lower ranges anyway, it seems to change a lot once you get higher. It's always fun to change sounds really quickly when there's a lot of sound going on. Yeah, the only reason I think that this sound works so well is because Reactor Spark normally has, let's see if I, 8 voices. Yeah, so you can only have 8 sounds going at one time, and that can kind of keep this sound under control. Let's say I were to move this to 15 voices, which again you cannot do in the player. Uh-oh, did I break it? I may have broken it. Alright, well, yeah, that one thing about Reactor. Alright. I made a mistake here, and that happens with Reaktor. In the full version of Reaktor, you can make mistakes just by messing with stuff, and I guess that's fine. That's just kind of a part of it. Allow me to get back to the preset I was on. But the point I was trying to make was that if that one sound had any more than maybe 8 or 10 voices, it would get really overbearing, because each note basically lasts forever. So that's kind of a situation where a small amount of voices is good for the sound. Okay, now that I have things... Good, now that I have things back working, there's one more preset I would like to share. Certainly a synthesizer worth $50, I would say. Reactor Spark is amazing. So, all in all, I would say of the elements selection that you get, I like Photon and Reactor Spark the most. I find those to be the most interesting and versatile synths in the package. I mean, each one of those could be, and one of them is, worth $50 in its own right. Not to mention that you have that contact selection from the last video. I mean, Komplete Elements is an unbelievable value for $50. Probably reflecting on the fact of how the full version of Komplete is an unbelievable value for $500 or even $1,000 for the Ultimate version. I mean, Native Instruments really does make some of the best software out there for some of the best prices. I mean, I guess that's something that really big companies can get to do. But I mean, their stuff is really that good. You'd think that if it's cheap, it must not be good, but I mean, take a look at this. The past 2-something hours have had to have proven to you that Native Instruments stuff is amazing. I mean, buy Komplete Elements. It is amazing. But yet there is still one more video. I'm going to next make a video on the guitar rig selection, and all of the cool effects you get in that, and for that I will be taking out my real guitar to play with that. Which, there aren't any good virtual guitars in this to use those effects with, so if you aren't a guitarist, the guitar rig effects, well, you might need to get clever to make a good use for them. I mean, some of the effects are good. There's some good reverb and EQ effects in there. But I love Guitar Rig. I think it sounds amazing. And I'm going to take out my real guitar and play around with that in the next video, as well as go back to the contact element selection and take a look at the 60s vintage drums. And I'm going to be using the drums with the guitar, because what goes better than drums and guitar? It's like peanut butter and jelly. But next, after that, in the same video, after I'm done with all the guitar stuff, I'm going to be comparing the 60s vintage drums to addictive drums, and potentially BFD Eco maybe. And to show you that even though the 60s vintage drums aren't as versatile, there isn't as much in there, it really doesn't sound a whole lot worse. I mean, the 60s vintage drums are fully capable drums for doing most of the stuff you'd want to do with drums. But that's all for the next video. This has been me looking at the Reaktor 5 selection for Komplete Elements, and I hope this was useful to you. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and check out my music on my SoundCloud account. I will see you in the next video.